Ukraine has answered Vladimir Putin's genocidal threats with a massive barrage of drone strikes across 6 Russian provinces. And it comes after an extraordinary week of diplomacy in which we learned that a US envoy has been coaching Russian officials on how to play the American president. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defense editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. Long-range strikes. Russian officials say that they have intercepted 136 drones across 6 Russian oblasts. We're going to start with the ones where there are reports of explosions on the ground. Taganrog, suggestions that there have been explosions at a military airfield that is on the Sea of Azov, around 130 miles outside Ukrainian territory. Also blasts at Smolensk, that's 180 miles inside Russian territory, and Saratov, that is right next to the Engels airbase. That is the furthest, some 350 miles inside Russia. But also reports from Russian officials: Bryansk, Volgograd, Voronezh, Kursk, Kaluga, and Moscow itself. Airports around the Russian capital have been closed overnight. And of course, this comes after earlier strikes during the course of this week. We've seen on November 25th at the Taganrog airfield suggestions that a Beriev A-60, that's an experimental plane that Russia was trying to mount laser-directed energy weapons onto, has been struck. So the explosions nearby there again overnight. And the Shatura power plant, which is some 300 miles inside Russia and about 70 miles east of Moscow, that was struck overnight on November 23rd. That has been the long-range strike, Ukraine's long-range strike. Coming the other way over the course of the last week, around 1,000 Russian missiles and drones have hit targets across Ukraine. That is lower than the week before. It was about 1,800 the week before. Latest figures, though, still not in. The real battle this week, though, has not been fought here in Ukraine so much as in diplomacy around the world. The most extraordinary bit of that battle has been the leaked phone calls that we have learned of between Steve Witkoff, who is Donald Trump's envoy, and Yuri Ushakov, who is Vladimir Putin's chief foreign policy advisor. In a phone call that took place mid-October, a transcript of which has been leaked to Bloomberg News and verified by their journalists there, Witkoff is heard coaching Ushakov on how to handle Donald Trump. He says, "Just reiterate that you congratulate the president, you respect that he is a man of peace." He's trying to help the Russians get their plan over the line. And I have to say, when I first heard this, I was slightly in two minds, thinking, well, of course, negotiators, you have to build a rapport, you have to try and understand the person you're negotiating with. But fundamentally, this is an American official, someone very close to Donald Trump, not trying to negotiate, not trying to broker, not trying to mediate, but ultimately trying to help Russia sell its position into the White House. And that is, I think, an extraordinary thing. Now, Donald Trump has backed Witkoff. Donald Trump has said that this is part and parcel of negotiations. He is suggesting that he would be saying similar things to both sides. This phone call came ahead of two things. It came ahead of a phone call between Putin and Trump, and that phone call came immediately ahead of a visit between Zelensky and Trump at the White House. And if you cast your minds back, up until that meeting, Trump appeared to have been losing patience with Russia. When that meeting took place, Trump appeared to have very much lost patience with Ukraine. It was quite a fraught meeting. Reports that Donald Trump was casting away the maps of the front line, that he wasn't interested. And that was the meeting where Donald Trump did not make good his own threats to give Ukraine Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles that had been on the table, that he or his top officials had said were on the table. So that phone call between Putin and Trump appeared to move the dial. And then after that came the 28-point peace plan. Now, this has been the week, the battle of the bullet points. That 28-point peace plan was drafted in Russia, delivered by Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin's banker, the head of Russian sovereign wealth fund, a former New York City banker. Kirill Dmitriev delivered that to Witkoff in Miami. America then presents that deal to Ukraine, Trump gave Ukraine until yesterday, Thanksgiving, to accept it. Ukraine and its allies, however, have played a diplomatic counteroffensive, if you like, which appears so far to have succeeded. It's never done and dusted. But they have appear to have got a stay of execution. Thanksgiving has passed. American aid has not been cut off. How did Ukraine do that? Deftly. They accepted the premise that they must negotiate. President Zelensky addressed the nation, said Ukraine was facing one of the most dangerous moments, difficult moments in its history, and they countered with their own 19-point peace plan. Russia's original plan talked about Ukraine ceding huge swathes of territory, all of Donetsk, including the areas Russia's been unable to capture by force, and freezing the front lines elsewhere. The 19-point peace plan that Ukraine countered with swerved some of those most difficult issues, and the idea was that they would be ironed out in a face-to-face meeting between Zelensky and Trump. But that meeting appears to have been pushed right until such a time that both sides can get closer to an agreement. Are they closer? Doesn't look like it. We heard from Finland's President Alexander Stubb, who was saying major issues remained. Zelensky said there's much work to do. We've heard from Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's right-hand man, insisting Zelensky will not sign any treaty that signs away Ukrainian territory. And how has Vladimir Putin responded? Well, those are the genocidal threats that I mentioned in the intro. He was speaking yesterday. He said, some people demand to keep on fighting until the last Ukrainian dies. Russia is ready for that. He said, if Ukrainian forces leave the territories they hold, then we will stop combat operations. If they don't, then we will achieve it by military force. So he is threatening to carry on fighting fundamentally until he has killed the last Ukrainian. It's fairly bombastic and bullish talk, but it won't come as a surprise to anybody here who's endured the indiscriminate, massive Russian bombardments and who's seen the way Russian forces fight on the front line. Of course, there's always a gap between rhetoric, what leaders say, and what they're privately prepared to concede in these sorts of negotiations. But at the moment, it would seem that both sides are back to openly stating their maximalist demands, that Ukraine will not cede territory and that Russia will keep fighting until Ukraine surrenders. So having had a week, 10 days of momentum towards peace, those negotiations are still ongoing, but at least the public rhetoric from Kyiv and Moscow appears to have gone backwards. It's worth thinking about where the forces are overall. Okay, so Russia now controls about 20% of Ukraine's territory. It has captured all of Luhansk. That is the only province it's successfully captured. It's captured about 75% of Donetsk, these two provinces together known as the Donbass. Over the last 20 months, an analysis by the Institute of the Study of War, or rather over 20 months, it took Russia 20 months to advance 25 kilometers from Andriivka to Pokrovsk, and then 5 months of intense urban fighting to take what they have managed to take of Pokrovsk, which is almost all of it, but not all of it. There are still 80 kilometers between the closest points in the furthest point in Russia's front line to the western edge from a Russian point of view, to the western edge of Donetsk province. Now, that would suggest it would take at least, at the current rates of advance, at least another 2.5 or 3 years to capture it. So suggestions that Ukraine is going to fall imminently, the Institute for the Study of War suggesting that is absolutely not true based on those sorts of figures. In the battle, Ukraine has launched limited counteroffensives in Pokrovsk itself, that town, the center of Russia's advances. They are clinging on to positions in the northern edges of the city, but it is, to all intents and purposes, most of that city appears to be lost. Russia's also continues to make advances around Huliopole. We talked about that last week as well. Its forces advancing westwards, threatening key roads, and they continue to be intense fighting around Kupiansk. Some extraordinary footage we've seen this week. A French-donated Mirage jet shooting down a missile, cockpit footage appearing to show that missile swerving off to the left of the pilot and hitting a Russian drone. Also footage from what we understand is a Russian drone dropping thermite onto an anti-drone net. Those are the nets that create sort of safe corridors over vulnerable roads to protect people driving underneath. Apparently, this is not a new tactic. It's interesting footage. I hadn't seen it before. It didn't say where or when it was shot, but nonetheless dramatic. And there's also been really unpleasant footage, but we have to report it, of up to 5 Ukrainian prisoners of war being executed in that offensive in Juliapole. So a chaotic retreat, we understand, in a position there. 5 Ukrainians reportedly captured, interrogated, and then shot at close range. That is deeply unpleasant, but I should say less extraordinary, because actually we have seen, tragically, this becoming more and more commonplace over the course of this war, to the point that many have suggested it's Russian policy to execute prisoners of war. And one thing there isn't footage of, but it's just a sort of and finally extraordinary bit of news, that Denmark, the Danish foreign ministry, according to the Danish press, has created a position within its foreign ministry known as the sort of Trump Watch, where a diplomat works through the night in Copenhagen to monitor what is happening in America, with a list of phone numbers of key civil servants to call in an emergency in case Donald Trump creates a crisis with something that he utters stateside. Interestingly, I would have assumed that might have been the job of the Danish embassy in America, but it's being done as well, doubled up in Copenhagen. As ever, if you have any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. Question number 1. This was put as a statement in the comments, but I'm going to treat it as a question. The question is, would a NATO guarantee for Ukraine immediately drag NATO into this conflict? And that's obviously because Ukraine wants to join NATO. It wants the Article 5 guarantee to safeguard it from future Russian attacks. If Ukraine were to become a member of NATO right now, then in theory, yes, any further Russian violence would be considered an attack on a NATO member, and it could trigger Article 5. A country that is at war technically cannot join NATO until its borders are secured and agreed. That's a precondition for joining NATO. So Ukraine technically cannot join while it is at war. Were it to secure a peace and then join NATO, would that drag NATO into a conflict? Well, potentially, but the question is, look at what's happened to the Baltic states. Look at what's happened to other countries that have joined NATO. The guarantee, the Article 5 guarantee, has kept them safe. Look at countries which wanted or considered joining NATO but didn't get over the wire. Georgia and Ukraine, they've not been kept safe. They have been attacked and invaded by Russia. Question number 2. If the US were to cut support to Ukraine, would it also cut support, would it also prevent Europe buying its weapons to give to Ukraine? All indications are no. Under Donald Trump, the policy has moved wholesale from giving Ukraine support to selling Ukraine support, and European countries have been buying that support off America. What might change, though, the key thing is US intelligence. There are certain elements of US support which are not necessarily financial, and Donald Trump has cut those off briefly in the past as part of his negotiations. But all indications are, even if America were to cut off its intelligence sharing, the sort of mercenary, mercantile nature of Donald Trump's White House is it would continue selling arms to Europe to give to Ukraine. Question number 3. Well, it's not really a question, but just so I should know, a lot of you saying in the comments here, what has Russia got on Trump? What has Putin got on Trump? I'm not going to go into that realm of speculation, but I will acknowledge that it has been such an extraordinary week in terms of US foreign policy, in terms of how we've seen the threats that Donald Trump, the pressure that Donald Trump put on Ukraine to effectively accept the terms of capitulation, and then that leak from Steve Witkoff of how he was handling, how he was approaching negotiations by coaching the Russians. Question number 4, would Ukraine attack Russian troops in Georgia? Short answer, never rule anything out. All forces of Russia are potentially legitimate targets because Ukraine is in a conflict with Russia, but those troops in Georgia do not present an immediate threat to Ukraine. Ukraine is stretched. It's fighting Russia where it thinks Ukraine's effort is going to be most effective. So that's on the front lines in Ukraine, and that's in the deep strike in Russia. It hasn't targeted Russian assets, as far as we know, in Belarus. It hasn't, for example, targeted Kaliningrad. It hasn't targeted Moldova and Transnistria. So therefore, I think very unlikely that it would target Russian troops in Georgia. As ever, thank you very much for watching. I've been speaking to you today from Kyiv. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I will do my very best to answer as many as I can next time.